What did a teacher do that still makes your blood boil years later? The email from Mr. Holloway arrived at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday in November, 3 days before my early decision application to Princeton was due. Subject line: Urgent, integrity concern. My stomach dropped before I even opened it because Mr. Holloway taught my AP literature class and had agreed to write one of my college recommendation letters. The email was brief and devastating. Liam, I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning before school. There's a serious problem with your application essay that we need to discuss. Do not submit anything until we talk. This is a matter of academic integrity. I read it 5 times, my hands shaking, trying to understand what he could possibly mean. My essay was about my father's death from cancer when I was 14, and how it had shaped my perspective on medicine and my desire to become a doctor. Every word was mine, painfully personal, revised a dozen times until it captured exactly what I wanted to say. I didn't sleep that night, lying in bed, running through every paragraph of my essay, searching for anything that could be construed as problematic. I'd cited the 2 medical journal articles I'd referenced, had my mother read it to make sure the details about my father's illness were accurate, had even run it through multiple plagiarism checkers online that all came back clean. By the time my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I was exhausted and terrified, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. I'd worked 4 years for this, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while working 20 hours a week at the hospital cafeteria to help my mom with bills. Princeton offered a full-ride scholarship program for students like me, first-generation college applicants from low-income families. It was my only realistic path to medical school, and now somehow my essay had an integrity concern, and I had no idea why. Mr. Holloway's classroom was empty when I arrived at 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes before our meeting time. I sat in the hallway outside his door, my backpack clutched against my chest, watching other students drift past on their way to early activities. Finally, at 7:28, he appeared, carrying his leather briefcase and a large coffee, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his sweater vest pressed and professional as always. He'd been teaching at Westbridge High for 23 years and was considered one of the best English teachers in the district, tough but fair, known for pushing students to dig deeper in their writing. I'd been thrilled when he'd agreed to recommend me for Princeton. Now the sight of him made my throat close with anxiety. He unlocked his classroom and gestured for me to follow him inside without greeting me or making eye contact. He closed the door behind us and sat at his desk, pulling out a folder with my name on it. "Liam, I'm disappointed," he said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine sadness. "When you asked me to recommend you for Princeton, I vouched for your character. I told the admissions committee you were a student of exceptional integrity and intellectual honesty. And now I've discovered that your application essay contains plagiarized material." The word plagiarized hit me like a physical blow. I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "I've done my research. Significant portions of your essay match published material online. I have the evidence right here." He opened the folder and pulled out several printed pages, my essay on top with sections highlighted in yellow, and beneath it what looked like printouts from websites. "Mr. Holloway, I wrote every word of that essay myself," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about my own father, my own experiences. There's no way it matches anything online because it's my personal story." He shook his head slowly, like a parent dealing with a lying child. "I want to believe you, Liam, but the evidence is clear. Look at this." He pushed the papers across the desk toward me. The highlighted sections in my essay were passages describing the hospital where my father received treatment, the emotional impact of watching him deteriorate, and my reflections on the medical system. Beneath each highlighted section was a printout from what appeared to be a blog post or article with similar language. My hands trembled as I read through them, and I felt my confusion growing into something darker. The passages weren't identical, but they had similar phrases, similar sentence structures, similar ideas. "These aren't the same," I said, pointing to the comparisons. "Look, the words are different. The experiences are different. This one is about someone's mother. Mine is about my father. This one talks about a hospital in Boston. Mine is about Memorial Regional. These are just common ways people describe grief and medical experiences." Mr. Holloway leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "Similar phrasing, similar structure, similar emotional beats. At best, you've internalized these sources without properly attributing them. At worst, you've deliberately copied other people's experiences and changed just enough details to make them seem like your own. Either way, it's academic dishonesty." I felt tears burning in my eyes and blinked them back furiously. I've never seen any of these sources before in my life. I don't know what these websites are. This is my real story about my real father who died 3 years ago. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to withdraw your Princeton application immediately. You'll write a new essay, completely original, and you'll apply regular decision to state schools where the competition isn't as fierce. I won't report this to the administration because I don't want to ruin your chances at college entirely, but I'm withdrawing my recommendation letter effective immediately. Consider this a learning experience, about the consequences of cutting corners." I couldn't breathe. Princeton's early decision deadline was in 3 days. If I withdrew now, I'd lose my chance at the full scholarship program, which only considered early applicants. Regular decision at Princeton had less than a 3% acceptance rate and almost no financial aid for late applicants. State schools might accept me, but they didn't offer the pre-med programs I needed, and I'd have to take out massive loans my mother and I couldn't afford. Please, I said, hating how desperate I sounded. Please just look at this more carefully. Run my essay through a real plagiarism checker, not just Google searches. Contact these websites and see when they were published. My essay has been through 3 drafts over 4 months. I have all my revision files with timestamps. I can prove I wrote this before some of these sources even existed. Mr. Holloway turned back to face me, and something in his expression made my blood run cold. It wasn't disappointment or even anger. It was satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for this moment. I've made my decision, Liam. You have until Monday to withdraw your application. If you don't, I'll be forced to contact Princeton directly and inform them of this situation, which will result in an automatic rejection and a notation on your permanent record. I'm trying to protect you here. Take the gift I'm offering. I walked out of his classroom in a daze, my entire future collapsing around me. In the hallway, I ran into my friend Marcus. Wait, I can't use that name. I ran into my friend David, who took one look at my face and pulled me into an empty stairwell. What happened? He asked, and I told him everything, the words spilling out in a confused rush. David had been my best friend since sophomore year, a brilliant student heading to MIT on a robotics scholarship, and one of the few people at Westbridge who understood the pressure of being a low-income student competing for elite schools. He listened to everything, his expression getting darker as I explained Mr. Holloway's accusations. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then said something that would change everything. You need to talk to Kimberly Yang. She had something similar happen with Holloway last year. Kimberly Yang was a senior when I was a junior, a student I barely knew except by reputation. She'd been valedictorian, brilliant writer, editor of the school newspaper, accepted early decision to Stanford on a full scholarship. But she'd ended up going to community college instead, and I'd heard vague rumors about a scandal or family emergency that had derailed her plans. David explained that Kimberly had worked in the library during her senior year, and he'd become friends with her while studying there. Last November, right around application deadline time, she'd come to school devastated because Mr. Holloway had accused her of plagiarizing her college essay and forced her to withdraw from Stanford. She'd tried to fight it, but the administration had sided with Holloway, and by the time everything was resolved, it was too late to reapply. David had lost touch with her after graduation, but thought she was still in town taking classes at Valley Community College. I found Kimberly that same afternoon working at a coffee shop near campus, wearing the green apron and taking orders with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was a small woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, probably early 20s now, and when I approached her during her break and mentioned Mr. Holloway's name, her entire demeanor changed. He got you too, she said, and it wasn't a question. We sat in the corner booth, and she told me her story, which was horrifyingly similar to mine. Last November, 3 days before Stanford's early decision deadline, Holloway had accused her of plagiarizing her application essay. He'd shown her evidence of similar passages from online sources, refused to accept her explanations, and threatened to report her to both Stanford and the school administration unless she withdrew her application immediately. Terrified and confused, she'd complied, thinking she could apply regular decision elsewhere. But Holloway had followed through on his threat anyway, sending letters to every school she applied to later that year, claiming she had integrity issues he couldn't in good conscience ignore. Why would he do that? I asked, though I already suspected I knew the answer. Kimberly's hands were shaking as she gripped her coffee cup. Because he doesn't think students like us deserve those opportunities. I'm first generation. My parents are immigrants who clean houses for a living. You're low income, your mom works 2 jobs. He decides who's worthy of elite education, and apparently we're not. She explained that after her Stanford dreams died, she'd done some research and found other students at Westbridge who'd had similar experiences with Holloway. 3 students over the past 5 years, all low income or first generation, all accused of plagiarism or integrity issues right before major application deadlines, all forced to give up opportunities at top-tier schools. None of them had fought back because Holloway wielded enormous power at the school, respected by the administration, beloved by wealthy parents whose kids he helped get into good colleges. There's a pattern, Kimberly said, pulling out her phone and showing me notes she'd compiled. Every year, right around early decision deadline time, he targets 1 or 2 students who are competing for elite schools with full financial aid. He manufactures evidence of plagiarism or fabricates concerns about their essays, pressures them to withdraw, and they lose their chance at those opportunities. Meanwhile, the wealthy students, the ones whose parents donate to the school or can afford full tuition anywhere, he writes glowing recommendations for them and helps them polish their applications. He's not just a teacher. He's a gatekeeper deciding based on class and background who deserves access to elite education. The coffee shop felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Everything was clicking into place in my mind with horrible clarity. Holloway hadn't found actual plagiarism in my essay. He'd manufactured similarities, searched the internet until he found passages that could be stretched to match mine, then used his authority and reputation to make his false accusations sound credible. I asked Kimberly why she hadn't gone to the police or the school board or the media with this information. Her laugh was bitter and hollow. I tried. I went to Principal Gaines and showed her everything, all my research about the pattern of students Holloway had targeted. She said I was making serious accusations without proof, that my disappointment about college was clouding my judgment, and that if I continued spreading rumors about a respected teacher, she'd have to note my behavior in my permanent file. I went to the school board, and they referred me back to the principal. I contacted a lawyer, and he said without concrete evidence of discrimination or fraud, there was no case. Holloway's smart. He doesn't leave a paper trail. He has face-to-face conversations, makes verbal accusations, deletes emails, and his reputation is so solid that anyone who accuses him looks like a bitter student with sour grapes about college rejections. She paused, studying my face. But maybe you can do something I couldn't. You still have time. Your deadline hasn't passed yet. If you can prove he's lying about your essay, maybe you can stop him from doing this to the next student. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my mother and told her everything. She'd worked doubles all week at the nursing home and looked exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, her dark hair showing more gray than I'd noticed before. But as I explained what Mr. Holloway had done, fury replaced exhaustion in her eyes. My mother had grown up poor in rural Louisiana, had gotten pregnant with me at 19 and raised me alone after my father disappeared before I was born. Wait, that doesn't work with the essay about father's cancer. Let me revise. My mother had worked 3 jobs to support us after my father died, sacrificing everything so I could focus on school and build a better life. The idea that a teacher would deliberately sabotage my future because of our economic circumstances ignited something fierce in her. "We fight this," she said, her voice absolute. "I don't care what it costs. Nobody gets to decide my son isn't worthy of his dreams." The next morning we met with Principal Gaines, a severe woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested our appointment was an inconvenience. I brought printouts of my essay along with all my revision files showing the development of my writing over 4 months, timestamps proving when I'd created each draft. I brought the plagiarism reports from 3 different online checking services, all showing 0 matches to existing sources. I brought the sources Mr. Holloway had claimed I'd plagiarized from, with highlighted sections showing how different they actually were from my work. My mother sat beside me, her hand gripping mine under the table, while I explained everything to Principal Gaines. When I finished, she folded her hands on her desk and said calmly, "Mr. Holloway is one of our most experienced teachers. He's helped hundreds of students achieve their college goals over 23 years. If he's identified an integrity concern in your essay, I trust his professional judgment." "But he's wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The evidence he showed me doesn't prove plagiarism. The passages are completely different. He's comparing common phrases that anyone writing about grief in hospitals would use." Principal Gaines pulled out a folder that I recognized with sick dread. She'd already talked to Holloway, had already seen his version of events, had already decided whose story to believe. "Mr. Holloway has documented significant similarities between your work and published sources. Whether intentional or not, you've failed to properly attribute ideas that aren't originally yours. That constitutes academic dishonesty under school policy." My mother leaned forward, her voice hard. "My son wrote that essay about watching his father die. It's his personal story. Nobody can plagiarize their own lived experience." Principal Gaines's expression didn't change. "I understand this is emotional for you, Mrs. Foster, but emotions don't excuse academic misconduct. I'm recommending Liam withdraw his Princeton application and take this as a learning opportunity about proper sourcing and attribution." We left that office with nothing accomplished except confirming what Kimberly had warned me about. The system protected. Holloway and students who challenged him were labeled as problems. That afternoon, I made a decision that terrified me. I called Princeton's admissions office directly and asked to speak to someone about an urgent concern with my application. After being transferred twice, I reached an admissions counselor named Patricia Stone, who listened as I explained the situation. I told her about Mr. Holloway's accusations, about the evidence that didn't actually show plagiarism, about Kimberly Yang, and the pattern of students he'd targeted. My voice shook the entire time, but I forced myself to get through it. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then, Patricia Stone said, "I need you to email me everything you just told me, along with your essay and any evidence you have. I'll escalate this to our Dean of Admissions. We take allegations of academic misconduct seriously, but we also take allegations of sabotage seriously." I spent the next 12 hours compiling everything into a detailed email with attachments, my essay with revision history and timestamps, the sources Holloway claimed I'd plagiarized, the plagiarism reports showing no matches, Kimberly's contact information and her story, the names of 3 other students she'd identified who'd been targeted by Holloway in previous years. I wrote out a timeline of events, from Holloway agreeing to recommend me to his sudden accusation 3 days before the deadline. I explained my family's financial situation and why this scholarship opportunity mattered so desperately. At 2:37 a.m., I finally hit send, then lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just made everything worse. Princeton could decide I was too much trouble and reject me outright. They could believe Holloway's version and blacklist me from other schools. I'd bet everything on strangers at an elite institution caring about fairness over reputation, and I had no idea if that bet would pay off. The response came faster than I expected. Patricia Stone emailed me Sunday evening, just over 24 hours after I'd sent my documentation. Princeton had conducted an expedited review of my essay using their own plagiarism detection software, which showed 0 matches to existing sources. They'd also had 3 different admissions counselors review the passages Holloway claimed were plagiarized, and all 3 agreed the similarities were superficial and common to the genre of personal tragedy essays. Most importantly, they'd contacted the websites where the supposedly matching content appeared and confirmed that 2 of them had been published after my early decision application submission date, making it literally impossible for me to have plagiarized from them. "We're moving forward with your application as submitted," Patricia Stone wrote. "Mr. Holloway's recommendation letter has been noted as contested. We encourage you to secure an additional letter from another teacher or counselor to provide a second perspective on your academic character." I should have felt relief or triumph, but instead I felt cold fury settling in my chest. Holloway had fabricated evidence, found sources published after my essay to make his accusations seem legitimate, and done it all knowing he could destroy my future with a few strategic lies. He'd done this to Kimberly and at least 3 other students before me, probably more we didn't know about, and he'd do it again next year to the next low-income student who threatened the carefully ordered world where elite education belonged to wealthy families who could afford it. Knowing I'd personally escaped his trap wasn't enough anymore. I wanted to burn his entire scheme down and make sure he never hurt another student. My mother found me at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by notes and printouts, researching education law and teacher misconduct policies. "Baby, you saved your Princeton application," she said gently. "You don't have to keep fighting." But I did have to, because rage was better than fear, and justice mattered more than just surviving. Monday morning, I walked into school with a plan that was probably stupid and definitely risky. I'd spent Sunday reaching out to the other students Kimberly had identified, Daniel Reeves, Cassandra Cole, and Justin Liu, all of whom had graduated in previous years and scattered to different colleges and jobs after their dreams of elite schools had been sabotaged by Holloway. Getting their contact information took some creative social media stalking and help from David, who seemed to know everyone's cousin or former roommate. I explained my situation and asked if they'd be willing to share their stories, to create a documented pattern that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. One by one, they agreed. Daniel sent me a 5-page account of how Holloway had accused him of fabricating volunteer hours on his Yale application. Cassandra described being told her essay about growing up in foster care was emotionally manipulative and likely exaggerated right before her Cornell deadline. Justin's story was almost identical to mine and Kimberly's, plagiarism accusations on his Harvard essay 3 days before submission, sources that were published after he'd written his draft, pressure to withdraw or face formal charges. With their permission, I compiled all 5 stories into a single document, anonymizing names but keeping specific dates, schools, and details of Holloway's accusations. The pattern was undeniable once laid out chronologically. Every November, targeting students applying early decision to top-tier schools, always low-income or first-generation students, always accusations timed to force immediate withdrawal without time for appeal. I made copies of everything and delivered one set to Principal Gaines with a cover letter requesting a formal investigation. She wasn't in her office, so I left it with her secretary and made sure to get a receipt, showing date and time of delivery. Then I did something that would either vindicate me or get me expelled. I sent the complete document to the Westbridge student newspaper, the school board president, the district superintendent, and the local newspaper's education reporter. Within 6 hours, my phone was exploding with messages. Principal Gaines called my mother, demanding I come to school immediately for an emergency meeting. When we arrived, we found not just the principal but also the school district's lawyer, a man named Frederick Sutton, who looked like he'd been pulled out of bed and wasn't happy about it. They sat us down in a conference room, and Frederick Sutton explained in carefully legal language that I had made serious allegations against a respected teacher without proper evidence, that distributing these allegations to media and school publications constituted defamation, and that I could face legal consequences for damaging Mr. Holloway's reputation. My mother cut him off mid-speech. "My son has documented evidence of a pattern of misconduct targeting low-income students. If you're threatening legal action, instead of investigating, we'll be hiring our own lawyer and going to the state education board. Try us." The room went very quiet. Frederick Sutton exchanged a look with Principal Gaines that told me everything I needed to know. They were scared, not of the truth, but of the publicity. That evening, the local newspaper published an article with the headline, "Elite High School Teacher Accused of Sabotaging Low-Income Students' College Dreams." It included interviews with Kimberly Yang and Daniel Reeves, both speaking on the record about their experiences with Mr. Holloway. The article detailed the pattern of accusations, the timing designed to prevent appeals, and the demographic targeting that suggested class discrimination. By Wednesday morning, 3 more former students had come forward with similar stories, expanding the documented pattern to 8 cases over 6 years. The school board announced an emergency meeting to discuss the allegations. Holloway was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to me. News crews showed up at school. Other students started sharing their own stories about feeling like Holloway treated wealthier students differently, giving them extra help and extensions while holding scholarship students to impossible standards. The investigation took 3 weeks, during which I submitted my Princeton application with a recommendation letter from my AP biology teacher instead, and tried to focus on finals while everything exploded around me. The school district hired an outside firm to review all of Holloway's student communications, recommendation letters, and accusation records from the past 6 years. What they found was damning beyond even what we documented. Holloway had kept detailed notes on students' family income levels, which schools they were applying to, and whether they were competing for need-based financial aid. His recommendation letters showed a stark pattern: glowing reviews for students from wealthy families applying to elite schools, tepid or negative reviews for low-income students applying to the same institutions. In several cases, he'd written enthusiastic letters for wealthy students while simultaneously torpedoing poor students' applications with manufactured integrity concerns. Most horrifyingly, they found draft emails on his school computer where he'd strategized with 2 other teachers about maintaining standards and ensuring qualified students got opportunities, with qualified clearly code for students from affluent backgrounds. The other 2 teachers implicated in the emails were suspended immediately. One of them, Mrs. Vance, taught college counseling and had apparently been steering low-income students away from elite schools for years by providing misleading information about financial aid and acceptance rates. The other, Mr. Pritchard, taught AP economics and had been marking down scholarship students' grades on subjective assignments while inflating grades for wealthy students, subtly sabotaging GPAs over time. The scope of the conspiracy expanded beyond what anyone had imagined. This wasn't just one bad teacher. This was a coordinated effort by multiple faculty members to preserve elite educational opportunities for students they deemed appropriately positioned for them, which meant students from wealthy families who represented the right kind of Westbridge graduate. The district attorney announced they were reviewing the case for potential criminal charges related to fraud and civil rights violations. Mr. Holloway's lawyer released a statement claiming the accusations were a witch hunt driven by disgruntled students who couldn't handle legitimate academic criticism. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public fury was intense. Parents whose children had lost opportunities discovered their kids had been systemically sabotaged. Wealthy parents whose children had benefited from the scheme faced backlash for participating in a rigged system. The school board held a public meeting in the gymnasium because too many people wanted to attend to fit in their usual conference room. I went with my mother and Kimberly, sitting in folding chairs while hundreds of parents and students demanded accountability. Speaker after speaker told stories of destroyed dreams of students who'd ended up at community colleges or gave up on education entirely after being convinced they weren't smart enough for elite schools. The rage in that room was palpable, a collective fury at betrayal by people who were supposed to nurture potential, regardless of background. The school board voted unanimously to terminate Mr. Holloway's employment, along with Mrs. Vance and Mr. Pritchard. They announced policy changes requiring multiple reviewers for any academic integrity, accusations, mandatory bias training for all faculty, and a new oversight committee that included student and parent representatives. But for the 8 students whose lives had already been derailed, for the unknown number who'd been discouraged or undermined in less documented ways, these changes came too late. Kimberly Yang had lost her Stanford scholarship and spent a year at community college before finally transferring to a state school, graduating 2 years behind where she should have been. Daniel Reeves had given up on medical school entirely after his Yale application was destroyed and was now working as a paramedic instead of pursuing his dream of becoming a surgeon. The others had similar stories of dreams deferred or abandoned, of paths altered by a teacher who decided their economic circumstances made them unworthy of opportunity. I got my acceptance letter from Princeton in mid-December, a thick envelope that included notification of a full-ride scholarship covering tuition, room, board, and expenses. My mother cried when I showed her, and I did too, but the victory felt complicated. I'd survived Holloway's sabotage only because I'd had the time and resources to fight back, because I'd connected with other victims who documented the pattern, because Princeton's admissions office had taken my allegations seriously instead of dismissing them. How many other students over the years hadn't had those advantages? How many had believed Holloway's accusations and internalized the message that they weren't good enough for elite education? The systemic nature of the injustice haunted me, even as I celebrated my personal win. The criminal investigation concluded in February, with charges filed against all 3 teachers. Holloway faced 15 counts of fraud and interference with educational opportunities. Vance and Pritchard faced similar charges. The prosecution's theory was that by systematically sabotaging low-income students' college applications while enhancing wealthy students' prospects, they'd created a fraudulent system that violated civil rights laws and constituted criminal conspiracy. The trial started in April, right as I was finishing my senior year and preparing for Princeton in the fall. I testified about my experience, describing Holloway's accusations and the fabricated evidence in detail. Kimberly testified, as did 6 other former students. Educational experts testified about the statistical impossibility of the documented pattern occurring naturally without intentional discrimination. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on most counts. Mr. Holloway showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, sitting straight-backed and rigid while his lawyer took notes. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison plus 5 years probation and ordered to pay restitution to the victims whose educational opportunities he'd destroyed. Mrs. Vance got 2 years. Mr. Pritchard got 18 months. The sentences felt simultaneously too harsh and not harsh enough. Prison time couldn't restore lost years or return scholarships or undo the psychological damage of being told you weren't worthy. But it sent a message that teachers who weaponized their authority against vulnerable students would face consequences. The local newspaper ran an editorial about the case titled "Gatekeepers and the Cost of Discrimination," calling it a cautionary tale about how prejudice could hide behind professional authority and devastate lives while looking like legitimate academic judgment. The civil cases were still ongoing when I left for Princeton that fall. 8 former students sued the school district for damages related to lost educational opportunities. The settlements ranged from $200,000 to $500,000, depending on the documented impact of Holloway's sabotage. Kimberly Yang's settlement included the district paying for her to complete her undergraduate degree and funding her graduate school education at Stanford, where she'd finally been accepted after reapplying with full documentation of what had happened. It couldn't erase the lost years, but it provided some measure of restitution. The school district also established a scholarship fund for low-income students from Westbridge High, ironically funded in part by money that should have gone to supporting those students all along, before Holloway and his allies had corrupted the system. My freshman year at Princeton was both thrilling and occasionally overwhelming, filled with students who'd attended elite prep schools and seemed effortlessly comfortable with academic expectations I had to work hard to meet. But I never forgot why I was there, or what I'd survived to get there. I volunteered with first-generation student groups and helped incoming freshmen navigate resources they might not know existed. I told my story often, to anyone who'd listen, about the teacher who'd tried to sabotage my dreams because he decided students from my background didn't deserve opportunities at elite institutions. Some people were shocked. Others nodded knowingly, having their own stories of teachers or counselors who'd steered them away from ambition or made them feel less capable based on economic circumstances. The systemic nature of educational gatekeeping became clearer the more I learned, but so did the importance of fighting it. Years later, I'd returned to Westbridge High as Dr. Liam Foster, a resident physician doing community outreach about healthcare careers, and find a school transformed by policy changes implemented after the scandal. A new college counseling system with multiple reviewers and mandatory documentation. Regular audits of recommendation letters to identify discriminatory patterns. Student advocates empowered to challenge academic accusations. None of it would have happened if Kimberly Yang hadn't been brave enough to research the pattern, if those other victims hadn't been willing to share their stories, if Princeton's admissions office hadn't taken my allegations seriously instead of dismissing them. Justice had been messy and incomplete, leaving scars on everyone involved, but it had been real. And standing in front of a classroom of students from all backgrounds, talking about paths to medical school, knowing that the gatekeepers who'd tried to limit those paths based on class had been stopped, I felt something like peace with the rage that had driven me to fight. Sometimes the system protects the wrong people, and sometimes one angry teenager with documentation can break that protection just enough to let truth and consequences through. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.